The early war years in the Pacific were defined by imbalance. Japan's air forces moved with an ease and confidence born from experience, flying aircraft that the Allied pilots quickly learned to respect and fear. The Zero's climb rate, its turning radius, and the fluid skill of its pilots set a tone that shaped the entire theater. When Allied fighters were forced to claw their way upward just to reach an interception altitude, the Japanese saw it as confirmation of what they already believed. Their aircraft were superior, their pilots better trained, and their climb performance unmatched. For months, the skies reflected that sentiment. American and Allied squadrons operated aircraft that performed adequately at lower altitudes but struggled when missions demanded rapid climb. The Japanese approach to air combat emphasized vertical dominance: gain altitude, dictate the engagement, descend with speed, and disengage freely. Their aircraft were built with that philosophy in mind, and early confrontations reinforced the belief that the Allies lacked the tools to challenge them in the vertical plane. So when whispers emerged about a new American fighter with a radial engine so large it seemed unbalanced, Japanese pilots initially dismissed the reports as exaggeration. When early reconnaissance photographs circulated showing a bulky silhouette with a large belly, oversized wings, and a fuselage that appeared heavier than ideal, they regarded the aircraft with skepticism. Many believed that whatever power the Americans were trying to generate under that massive cowling would be offset by weight and drag. In their eyes, nothing the Allies produced would climb with the grace or speed of a Zero. Those assumptions began to fracture the moment the P-47 Thunderbolt entered operational service in the Pacific. Even before pilots engaged in combat, stories emerged about the raw power built into that aircraft. The engine alone, an 18-cylinder radial delivering levels of thrust uncommon for its time, was enough to change expectations. The addition of a turbo supercharger system allowed it to retain power even at higher altitudes where other fighters began to fade. It was an aircraft built not for elegance, but for brute performance, and the engineers who created it understood precisely what the demands of the Pacific would require. When the first squadrons arrived, their presence drew attention. The Thunderbolt did not resemble any fighter the Japanese had faced. Its size, its profile, and even the heavy framework of its wings signaled that this was something fundamentally different. Pilots who taxied it across rough island runways could feel the weight of the machine beneath them, a weight made irrelevant the moment the engine reached its operational RPM. The aircraft did not simply roll forward, it surged. Once airborne, pilots reported sensations that broke from the normal expectations of wartime aviation. The turbo system forced air into the engine in quantities that produced acceleration rarely seen in fighters of that era. Still, rumors were not enough to change perceptions. Japanese air groups observing the new American arrivals expected the same outcomes they had always achieved. If the Thunderbolt was as large as it appeared, they reasoned, then it could not possibly climb well. They believed its mass would make it slow to respond, slow to rise, and easy to outmaneuver. It seemed impossible for such an aircraft to threaten elite pilots who had built their tactics around the vertical advantage. That belief did not last long. The first missions flown by the Thunderbolts were routine escorts, mostly uneventful except for internal squadron observations. Pilots recorded data on climb rates, performance under heat, and the stability of the aircraft in sustained ascent. What they discovered astonished even the aircrews assigned to fly them. When the turbocharger engaged and the engine reached full output, the Thunderbolt began to climb with a force that contradicted its appearance entirely. It did not merely ascend, it drove upward as if pulled toward the sky by an unseen pressure. At altitudes where most engines began to starve, the P-47 systems continued delivering power, allowing the aircraft to maintain climb rates that other fighters could only attempt at lower elevations. The turning point, both in perception and in operational reality, occurred on a day that began like countless others. A formation of American medium bombers required escort through a region where Japanese fighters routinely challenged air superiority. The Thunderbolts launched as scheduled, climbed into protective position, and maintained their escort pattern as the formation crossed into contested airspace. The Japanese interceptors appeared on schedule, descending from a position of advantage. Yet as they approached, something unexpected happened. The Thunderbolts did not remain level, nor did they defer altitude as many Allied fighters had previously been forced to do. Instead, they began to climb directly toward the incoming threat. The Japanese pilots saw the motion but dismissed it at first. They assumed the American fighters were attempting a short burst of altitude gain, something that would stall quickly or fade once the aircraft reached a certain height. But the Thunderbolts continued climbing, and kept climbing. And then, in full view of experienced combat aviators, they began outclimbing fighters that had once been the standard by which all vertical performance was measured. Observers reported that the change in expression among the intercepting pilots was visible even through canopy reflections. Whatever they expected the Thunderbolt to do, this was not it. The American fighters rose with a consistency that suggested more than engine output. It suggested a fundamental shift in capability. The zero-angle rate of climb, the power retention at altitude, and the speed with which the Thunderbolts maneuvered into intercept position forced a recalculation in real time. This was no longer an underdog engagement. This was an aircraft capable of challenging, directly and decisively, the vertical dominance that Japanese pilots had used for years to control the battlefield. Once the Thunderbolts reached parity, the engagement changed character. Instead of reactive defense, American pilots used their newfound altitude to shape the fight. They used their mass to their advantage, converting altitude into speed during dives, then using the same turbo-assisted climb behavior to reset the engagement. The Japanese pilots found themselves facing a machine that could ascend like a much lighter fighter, yet descend with the crushing acceleration of a heavyweight. Reports began circulating within Japanese units. Something was different about the new American aircraft. Its climb rate contradicted its design. Its performance at altitude contradicted its size. Pilots attempting to intercept it returned with stories of failed ascents, missed timing, and difficulty executing vertical maneuvers that had once been standard. For American pilots, the experience was equally transformative. The Thunderbolt gave them not just a new tool, but a new level of confidence. For years, engagements in the Pacific had required careful planning to avoid altitude disadvantages. Now pilots could initiate climbs at moments when such decisions would previously have been ill-advised. They could reposition above enemy formations, disrupt attack runs, and choose when to commit rather than waiting for openings. It was not just a change in aircraft performance. It was a psychological shift. As the weeks continued, the pattern repeated. Interceptions that once seemed inevitable now ended in stalemates or American advantage. Enemy pilots accustomed to commanding the climb found themselves unable to match it, and each encounter fed into a growing realization throughout the Japanese air forces. The Thunderbolt represented a new problem, one that could not be dismissed or ignored. This first segment frames the turning point, the moment when the Japanese Air Service understood that something had changed in the sky above them. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once doubted, once mocked, had introduced a capability that forced every pilot in the region to reassess the balance of power. The first reports coming from the forward radar stations were confusing. Operators were used to tracking the slow, deliberate climbs of American fighters. They knew the signatures. They knew the steady vertical rise of older P-40s and the sluggish arcs of bombers trying to gain altitude before committing to a bombing run. But on this particular morning, the radar blips surged upward so fast that the operators thought the equipment was malfunctioning. The climb profile was too steep, too abrupt, too unnatural for any American fighter they had tracked before. Messages went out to the interceptor units. Pilots of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force were told that unidentified aircraft were climbing at a rate previously considered impossible for the Americans. The initial assumption was that the readings belonged to experimental or prototype aircraft, but when visual confirmation arrived, the shock spread quickly. The aircraft streaking upward were unmistakably P-47 Thunderbolts, machines the Japanese believed they understood completely. They believed the Thunderbolt was heavy, slow to climb, and limited in vertical performance. Now those assumptions were no longer safe. On the other side of the sky, the American pilots climbing in tight formation felt the difference immediately. The new engine settings, revised turbocharger sequences, and refined climb protocols had transformed their aircraft. The changes were subtle on paper but enormous in effect. The Thunderbolt's massive frame, once criticized for sluggishness, now translated raw horsepower into controlled, powerful ascent. The pilots sensed the stability. They felt the responsiveness in their instruments and flight controls. The aircraft that once required patience to coax upward now rose with confidence and authority. The climb had been rehearsed repeatedly in the days before the mission. Engineers had worked alongside pilots, adjusting parameters, refining throttle steps, and testing the revised cooling cycles required for sustained vertical power. The training emphasized smoothness and precision. Do not force the climb. Let the engine build momentum, trust the power, stick to the sequence. When executed correctly, the aircraft behaved like an entirely different machine. The climb was no longer a limitation. It was a weapon. Japanese reconnaissance pilots observing from a distance were the first to realize how dangerous this development was. They watched the Thunderbolts rise above the cloud cover with a speed that made interception nearly impossible. Altitude had always been a decisive advantage in air combat, and now the Americans were seizing it faster than expected. Even before the two sides met, the balance of the engagement had shifted. In earlier months, Japanese fighters had used their superior climb rates to dictate the terms of battle. They chose when to engage and when to retreat. They attacked from above, using gravity and maneuverability to compensate for the heavier firepower of the American aircraft. Now that advantage was slipping away. The P-47s were not only reaching equal altitude, they were reaching it first. Inside one of the climbing Thunderbolts, the lead pilot monitored the temperature gauges and engine response. Everything was holding steady. The revised turbocharger setup maintained pressure even at steep ascent, something previous settings struggled to achieve. He continued the sequence, adjusting the throttle in smooth, deliberate motions. The aircraft surged upward. His squadron followed closely behind, each pilot repeating the same well-practiced routine. It felt like they were finally unlocking the potential of the machine, potential that had been waiting inside the aircraft from the moment it rolled out of the factory. Radio chatter remained minimal. The pilots conserved oxygen and focused on their gauges. The sky above shifted from pale blue to crisp, thin air. They were approaching a layer of altitude that American fighters rarely reached before their Japanese opponents. For the first time in many missions, the American pilots were climbing into a position of dominance rather than defending from below. Then came the first sightings. Dark silhouettes appeared in the distance, Japanese fighters patrolling at altitude, expecting to find American aircraft far beneath them. But as the Thunderbolts rose sharply through the cloud layer, the silhouettes grew larger and more distinct. The Japanese patrols had no warning. Their assumption was simple: no American fighters should be here this fast. The moment of realization spread through both formations. For the Thunderbolt pilots, it was a moment of long-awaited validation. For the Japanese pilots, it was a moment of alarm. Their advantage had evaporated before the engagement even began. The Japanese flight leader attempted to reorganize his formation. He needed altitude. He needed time. He needed space to maneuver his lighter aircraft into a favorable position. But the P-47s continued to climb, leveling off just long enough to stabilize their attack line before resuming short bursts upward. They were not just matching the Japanese, they were overtaking them. This was not how the Japanese pilots had trained to fight Thunderbolts. They were prepared for the American fighters that struggled to climb. They were prepared for the slow ascents and the predictable patterns. But the new behavior of the P-47 disrupted every expectation they had. The Thunderbolts now possessed the two qualities that most threatened the Japanese style of combat: altitude and momentum. The first confrontation was brief but revealing. A pair of Thunderbolts swept past a group of surprised Japanese fighters, gaining altitude even as they passed overhead. The Japanese pilots attempted to swing upward in pursuit, but their climb angles were too shallow. The Thunderbolts pulled ahead effortlessly. The shift in power dynamic was unmistakable. Below, additional P-47 formations were beginning their climb. The sky gradually filled with American aircraft rising at a rate that few Japanese pilots had ever witnessed. Observers on the ground radioed warnings, but by the time the messages reached the upper patrols, the situation was already unfolding. The Thunderbolts had reached a level of performance that made traditional interception tactics unreliable. This transformation was not the work of a single innovation, but a combination of small adjustments, each building on the capabilities already present. The result was a fighter that could capitalize on its immense horsepower in ways its designers had always hoped for, but that operational conditions had previously limited. Once the limits were understood and overcome, the aircraft revealed its true nature. The Japanese pilots now faced an American fighter that climbed like a machine designed for vertical dominance. The Thunderbolt was no longer a target struggling to catch up. It was an aggressor taking control of the sky. The surprise inside the Japanese command rooms did not form overnight. It grew from a sequence of encounters that seemed minor at first. These early reports carried the same tone Japanese pilots used whenever they believed they understood the enemy's aircraft. They had confidence in their acceleration, turn radius, low-speed maneuvering, and the ability to dictate the vertical tempo of a fight. For months, their evaluations of American fighters followed familiar patterns. They noted weaknesses, categorized strengths, and applied tactics that had worked reliably since the first days of the Pacific War. What they were not prepared for was a sudden change in how the P-47 entered the fight. In earlier engagements, the Thunderbolt often appeared late, dove quickly, fired a short burst, and disappeared again. Its pilots relied heavily on hit-and-run tactics because vertical maneuvering cost energy, and climbing back to altitude was a slow process. This predictable behavior allowed Japanese pilots to prepare counter-responses. They would force the P-47 to extend, and then chase it with aircraft that gained altitude far better. But when the new climb technique began spreading through American units, the rhythm of combat shifted so gradually that at first few realized what had changed. P-47s were now entering attacks from unexpected angles, rising back to the upper layers of the sky as if pulled upward. They were no longer trapped in low-altitude merges. They were no longer forced into long, vulnerable extensions after each attack. They were beginning to reclaim the vertical plane, a battle space Japan had dominated since the start of the war. The Japanese pilots who survived these first encounters described the same pattern. They approached the Thunderbolt expecting it to remain low or maintain a shallow climb, but instead they watched it rise sharply, the aircraft's wings trembling under heavy throttle. These pilots were accustomed to seeing American fighters float upward with modest progress. This new behavior did not match their training, nor did it match the performance data they had memorized. From the ground stations, observers noticed another shift. Radar and visual posts reported Thunderbolt formations climbing earlier in their transit routes. Instead of cruising at moderate altitudes and spiraling slowly upward, they were now ascending rapidly and efficiently, reaching patrol heights faster than before. This created a new timing problem for Japanese interception forces. By the time they launched aircraft to meet incoming American strikes, the P-47 escorts were already positioned higher, waiting in the cold air where their diving advantage multiplied. The Japanese planners could not determine whether these changes came from new engines, improved superchargers, or a redesigned airframe. None of these explanations were correct. The transformation resulted from a technique so simple that it spread through American units almost instantly: a coordinated climb pattern that used power, throttle transitions, and staggered formation spacing to maintain constant engine loading. To the Japanese, this new behavior appeared like a mechanical breakthrough. They assumed the Americans had quietly introduced a new variant, one with a supercharger beyond anything they had seen before. Their intelligence branches began collecting fragments from downed Thunderbolts to search for clues. They found nothing unusual, which only deepened the confusion. Meanwhile, P-47 pilots in the field were adjusting naturally to the improved climb cycle. The technique allowed them to hold altitude with far less energy loss, enter combat scenarios from stronger initial positions, and preserve speed through the upper arc of a maneuver. They were still flying the same aircraft with the same engines, but the handling characteristics felt different. Many pilots described the sensation as finally having the aircraft respond the way its horsepower promised. This emerging confidence produced noticeable results. Bombers reported fewer interception attempts. Escort groups remained tightly stacked at altitude, ready to dive at any threat. Japanese fighters trying to climb into these formations often stalled out early or were forced into shallow pursuits. The fight no longer opened on their terms. The angles of engagement shifted. The P-47s were setting the altitude tone for the first time. The new climbing pattern also had a psychological impact. Japanese pilots trained extensively in reading the enemy's behavior, but this adjustment undermined their expectations. The Thunderbolt, once dismissed as heavy and predictable, was suddenly demonstrating energy management normally associated with lighter aircraft. The shift in perception produced a type of caution that had not existed before. While previously they had pursued P-47s aggressively in the vertical plane, they now observed the Thunderbolt's upward trajectory with hesitation. This caution affected the tempo of entire engagements. American strike groups found themselves under less consistent pressure during the vulnerable early phases of missions. With their escorts climbing sooner and holding altitude longer, the protective umbrella around bomber formations thickened. Japanese attack waves were meeting more resistance before they could establish firing lines. The atmosphere inside Japanese air units reflected these changes. Some believed the Americans had discovered a way to push the supercharger beyond safe limits. Others believed the Thunderbolt had undergone a structural redesign. A few pilots suspected that American training had improved, though they underestimated how quickly new tactics could be adopted across multiple squadrons. In combat debriefs, Japanese flight leaders emphasized the need to adapt, but adapting to a shift in vertical performance is one of the most difficult challenges in aerial warfare. Their pre-existing tactics relied on predictable energy curves. Now those curves were no longer consistent. A Thunderbolt climbing at an angle once considered unachievable disrupted the timing of intercept maneuvers, merge choices, and escape paths. These early observations, though small, marked the beginning of a broader realization. The Americans had found a way to unlock performance from the P-47 that had always been present but rarely harnessed. The Thunderbolt's engine had the horsepower, the airframe had the stability. What it needed was a method, and that method had arrived. As the technique continued spreading, the gap between American and Japanese assessments widened. Battles that had once been controlled by Japanese altitude tactics shifted in favor of the P-47. The Japanese pilots began reporting something new in their coded transmissions. Thunderbolts were climbing like rockets. Their choice of language was not exaggeration. It was the first acknowledgement that the aircraft they once underestimated was transforming into a threat capable of reshaping the vertical dynamics of the war. The Japanese pilots who first reported the new American climb performance were not inexperienced aviators. Many of them had flown since the early stages of the war, had fought over China, the Philippines, and the early battles around New Guinea. They had learned to evaluate aircraft behavior with precision, often forming judgments in seconds, and their reports had historically been consistent. For years, they observed American fighters climbing predictably and losing energy in vertical maneuvers. But when they saw the new P-47 climb behavior, the reaction was immediate because it contradicted everything they had already established through combat experience. What changed for them was not the appearance of the Thunderbolt, which they already knew as a large and durable fighter, but the way it now used altitude. Instead of engaging horizontally and avoiding steep climbs early in a fight, the P-47 units began using altitude as a renewable resource. This altered not only the pace of engagements but the channels of advantage. High-altitude dominance is not a temporary advantage, it becomes a structural one. It shapes where the enemy can maneuver, how long they can sustain an attack, and whether they can escape without burning excessive fuel or composure. Japanese fighter doctrine relied heavily on initiating combat from above. Their aircraft excelled at lightweight vertical acceleration, but this strength depended on the enemy being physically lower. Once the P-47s consistently held superior altitude, the Japanese formations lost the privilege of choosing the first strike. Each P-47 group, now approaching from higher layers of the sky, dictated when compression began, when separation occurred, and when the Japanese pilots were forced to either break upward or commit downward. Both options carried risk. Climbing into a heavier aircraft that had already established a vertical advantage was inefficient. Diving away from it did not guarantee escape, because newer P-47 tactics incorporated controlled dives, followed by sustained climbs to re-engage from the same upper space. The Japanese reports described this shift not as a tactical inconvenience, but as a change in operational expectations. When pilots reported Thunderbolts climbing like rockets, the expression did not refer to literal ascent speed, but rather to the unexpected acceleration in the mid-climb zone where heavier aircraft typically lost effectiveness. The new P-47 climb profile rose steadily without the usual taper that made its path predictable. For Japanese units accustomed to tracking an enemy's climb until its speed fell off, the sustained energy of the Thunderbolt introduced uncertainty. Their timing windows, once precise, now widened into guesses. In aerial combat, uncertainty does not simply weaken performance. It degrades mental rhythm, making every engagement feel less controlled. This altered perception had a measurable effect on pre-attack spacing. Japanese formations began increasing lateral separation to avoid being caught by Thunderbolts descending from unexpected heights. This spacing made mutual support more difficult. A formation too wide takes longer to reconcentrate, and Thunderbolt squadrons exploited this by selecting isolated elements. Japanese pilots who once used tight formation flying to maximize coordinated angles now found that the safest defensive measure made their offensive capability less consistent. The P-47's new climb behavior also influenced escape patterns. Japanese pilots previously broke upward when disengaging from American fighters because they expected to outclimb heavier aircraft. When that advantage eroded, upward breaks no longer guaranteed clearance. Instead, they risked climbing into a Thunderbolt already positioned above them. This forced more downward exits, but descending into American territory or toward American escort layers brought separate dangers. In practice, the Japanese pilots encountered a narrowing of safe retreat paths, which translated to more aggressive pushes early in combat. Their logic was simple: eliminating the Thunderbolt early was safer than trying to disengage from it later. But this shift forced Japanese units to seek attack angles rapidly, sometimes before proper positioning developed, leading to unfavorable merges. Another significant factor was the mental weight of encountering a previously understood opponent whose performance profile suddenly changed. Combat aviators rely heavily on accumulated pattern recognition. When patterns collapse, every known rule must be re-evaluated in real time. Japanese pilots described Thunderbolts climbing through positions that would have been unreachable months earlier. They observed them gaining altitude after turning maneuvers that previously drained their energy. These observations did not merely adjust tactical opinions, they disrupted the expected structure of dogfight geometry. American pilots, now confident in both their power and altitude retention, began designing engagements around longer vertical loops. Instead of short climbs followed by quick returns, they extended their upward movement, knowing their aircraft would not stall prematurely. This created additional time for situational awareness and allowed Thunderbolt pilots to reorganize the fight around broader arcs rather than tight brawls. Japanese fighters, which excelled in tight turning combat, could not easily impose their preferred shape on these new engagements. The Thunderbolt's pilots began shaping the flow of battle with energy rather than tight radius flight. This shift also changed how Japanese pilots interpreted the Thunderbolt silhouette. The large frame, once regarded as a target that could not climb aggressively, now became a visual reminder of an aircraft that did not behave according to its appearance. Combat psychology often magnifies these mismatches. When an aircraft looks heavy but performs lightly in vertical space, it disrupts baseline instinct. The Thunderbolt's reputation shifted gradually as more Japanese pilots encountered its updated behavior. What began as isolated reports evolved into unit-level briefings, then into regional theater notes that warned pilots not to assume a vertical advantage. The transformation was not only a technical matter but a cumulative one. Each encounter added data, each climb surprised another pilot, each failed escape reinforced the new reality. Japanese squadrons that once treated the P-47 as a manageable opponent now treated altitude disadvantage as a critical vulnerability rather than a temporary inconvenience. The shift in strategic perception grew naturally from repeated experience, not from sudden revelation. Through this entire period, the Thunderbolt's units recognized the psychological effect of their new capabilities. Holding altitude was not only a tactical benefit but a message. Maintaining the upper sky meant owning the initiative. The Japanese pilots who first witnessed the P-47's sustained climb were observing more than a performance upgrade. They were witnessing the recalibration of an opponent's identity, and with it, the restructuring of the air war's vertical dimension. The result was a theater where American pilots engaged with renewed confidence, applying climb-driven maneuvers that had previously been impractical, while Japanese pilots adapted to a sky where old assumptions no longer applied. The shift did not happen in one battle or one mission. It emerged through repeated encounters where Thunderbolts held the upper lines, refused to drop out of vertical contests, and redefined what their aircraft could impose on an enemy trained to exploit weight and energy disadvantages. It was a structural change, and by the time it was fully recognized, the air war's geometry had already been altered. The sudden burst of performance from the P-47s was not a single, isolated moment. It repeated itself again and again across the next several weeks, each time leaving Japanese pilots more uncertain about what they thought they understood. Reports began circulating through different fighter units, each sharing variations of the same story. The American Thunderbolt was no longer the heavy, sluggish climber they had known. It was behaving like a completely different aircraft. Japanese intelligence officers initially dismissed the claims. They believed pilots were confusing models or misjudging angles, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Whenever a P-47 flight intercepted bombers or fighter sweeps, the same thing happened. The Thunderbolts climbed earlier, held their lines longer, and reached altitudes the Japanese assumed were unreachable for such a large airframe. What confused them most was how quickly the Americans seemed to reposition. A pair of P-47s would be thousands of feet below, appearing to pose no threat, yet moments later they were level with the Japanese formations, merging angles with surprising precision. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't reckless, it was deliberate, controlled, and repeatable. The Japanese pilots began adjusting tactics. They shifted climb schedules, they changed rendezvous points, they tried earlier throttles on, they increased spacing to allow for more flexibility. And yet the Thunderbolt still cut through the air with that same new urgency, climbing in ways that rewrote assumptions. This newfound capability changed the rhythm of the air war. Missions that had once followed predictable patterns now unfolded with constant tension. Japanese formations could no longer rely on altitude as their insurance. Every climb-out demanded constant scanning. Every cloud layer held the possibility of a thunderbolt rising through it faster than expected. The psychological effect was immense. Japanese pilots began burning more fuel early, trying to stay ahead of potential P-47 interceptors. Some units shortened patrol times, others increased escorts. The cost of caution began to accumulate. Meanwhile, the American pilots themselves felt the difference every time they took off. They trusted the new climb technique. They knew exactly how to time their throttle transitions, mixture settings, and turbo lever adjustments. And once they felt the surge between mid-altitude and high-altitude bands, they understood why the Japanese were being caught off guard so consistently. The Thunderbolt had gone from merely surviving the climb to dominating it. And with each engagement, the Japanese Air Force was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their assumptions, built over years of experience, no longer applied. The P-47 was rewriting the rulebook. And the pilots flying it were learning that their aircraft was not only tough, not only fast in a dive, but now capable of seizing the one advantage the Japanese once believed was theirs alone: superior vertical control. As the weeks passed, stories spread through the Japanese ranks of Thunderbolts, appearing out of nowhere, of climbs that defied the aircraft's known limits, of engagements where P-47s forced fights from above rather than below. These were not exaggerations. They were the visible signs of a tactical shift that few saw coming, a shift that would only deepen as the Americans refined the method even further. The Japanese Air Force had been shocked by the first demonstrations. But the true consequences of this newfound climb capability were only beginning to reveal themselves.